Hello, I am Shrestha. I am from Section 1 of Intro to Game Design, and today I'll be presenting my lens project, specifically on the lens of skill. And to do this, we'll be analyzing the game Doom Eternal. So for some background, Doom Eternal is a first-person shooter game focused on player versus environment, which is single player, and it also very much focuses on high-intensity gameplay and action, which makes it perfect for the lens of skill. So the design of the game. A game's general design should correlate with the type of skill needed, and also so should the game's mechanics. It should be shaped the way with what the skill is desired. And even the aesthetic and narrative of the game should correlate with the skill. So for example, for Doom Eternal, the Doom Eternal's mechanics are very much a first-person shooter. It's oriented around shooting enemies in a first-person point of view and using different militaristic equipment to eliminate threats. And there are also shooter mechanic, and these shooter mechanics brings skills such as precision and reflexes. Now, the game is meant to feel like an intense shooter, which is why mechanics are meant to have the player move around quickly, such as the dashes and the meat hooks, which is a grapple connected to your super shotgun that brings you specifically towards enemies. The game's aesthetic and narrative also very much fit this intense profile, as the game has a very well-known heavy metal soundtrack, which makes the game play way more intense. You're listening to it right now in the background, and this is what goes on throughout the whole game. And there's also extreme gore that intensifies this sort of mood. The game's narrative is also about going to different places and slaying demons with giant, oversized firearms with a lot of firepower, which gives this very intense impression. Now, the required skills. So, almost every game should require certain skills from the player in order for them to complete the game in an enjoyable manner. And so different games will require different amounts of skill. Some games have levels of difficulty, and so the kind of skills that a game wants to require can differ from game to game. So some might require more psychological skills, and some might require more physical skills. We'll get back to that in a minute. And so any games that require skills to play will be reacted to differently depending on whoever is playing the game. So certain players in any game will be more skillful than other players. That's just sort of how it works with multiple people doing any sort of task. And depending on the skill level, the experiences might be incredibly different, especially for games where players have to face each other to win objectives, like player versus player games. The level of skill of certain players will put them at advantage over players without as much skill, which could sometimes come off as a bit unfair, especially when the game is competitive. However, in most games, the initial skill of a player may not restrain them forever. It shouldn't be constant, as many games allow players to become better as they play more. Similar to how in a sport, nobody's an all-star on the first day, they have to practice a lot. The amount of skill a game might demand will vary from game to game depending on what the game developers expect from the audience. Some might be a lot more intense, and others might be more relaxed and might not expect too much from the demographic. For the example of Doom Eternal has a variety of skill required for the game, as there are two main distinct sections of every level. There are puzzles, there are sections of the games without any action where you traverse the terrain using climbing and dashing, and do puzzles, such as having to shoot triggers or punch buttons in order to get from place to place. However, the game's dominant skill is combat. It's the meat of the game, using quick reflexes to avoid enemies and precision to shoot back at them, and also timely management of resources such as your weapon ammunition and optimizing which weapons you use against specific enemies, because as you can see in this gameplay, the player uses all of the weapons in a very complex manner because this game requires every weapon to be used. That is sort of the gameplay loop. And the amount of skill required, there are different levels of difficulty ranging from easy modes to more difficult modes, but this game has a demographic which is known for playing those more difficult modes with higher difficulties. Now, the way the skill affects the game, because of how much skill is required, there's a vast difference in skill level between players of the player base. Some are extremely advanced, and by sinking countless hours and skill into this game, they can do crazy things. Like you see in this gameplay, most people can't do this kind of thing. Most people are more casual and might not be as advanced because they haven't put as much work into this. Most of the game is single player, which means that the game isn't really competitive against player and player. So players shouldn't really feel like they're at a disadvantage for the fact that there are other people that are better. Now, the game does have an online multiplayer competitive mode, and even then, it's not that big of a mode. It's not meant to overshadow the single player at all. So the main mode, the single player mode, That's sort of what the game focuses on, and the amount of skill required, it feels right. The intensity of the skill required fits with the intensity of the game itself. The creators of the game have stated that the game is meant to be a power fantasy that is earned, meaning the game makes you feel great, but that's if you are great. That's sort of, you need to work in order to feel that power. And so the overall experience of the game, so the experience of a game factors in three main components. It's the narrative, the aesthetics or themes, and the gameplay loop. And the skills needed of a player for the game will also play a large role in the overall experience, such as satisfaction. And there are two main parts for satisfaction. This is satisfaction in the feeling that the game is fair because the game was playable and it didn't feel broken in a way that unfairly hindered a player's progress. And there's also the satisfaction that puts great importance on a game feeling challenging, enough that playing the game gives a sense of completion and intrinsic reward for the player, that they feel like they accomplished something. A game being too easy might not be as satisfactory as one that causes the player to have to push themselves to be victorious and win. So, for the example of Doom Eternal, I think Doom Eternal satisfies both of these parts of satisfactory, as the game is designed to be fair, as enemies are relatively straightforward, as how you approach them, most of them aren't that complicated. You can shoot them and they die. And the game is also polished well enough, so it doesn't really feel broken or imbalanced. But the game is also very challenging, and as a result of the challenge and the overall atmosphere of the game, it is incredibly rewarding to succeed. When you succeed, when you win, you feel great power, you feel strong, and you really feel like you are that giant guy ripping through the demonic horde. Now, to close off this video, the lens of skill is very substantial to a game and success and experience. Without skill, players might not feel that involved, because the skill turns a digital video game into a truly immersive experience that gives players a sense of truly interacting with the game world, struggling as they would in the real world, and the skill allows room for growth in certain areas and satisfaction. And I think Doom Eternal correctly hits all these aspects of skill with a game that thrives on satisfaction brought by a skillful challenge, which makes it a good example for the lens of skill. Anyways, thank you for watching, and goodbye.